This contraption is called the air seat. And if you're looking for a little bit of extra comfort on your bike, this might be a good product for you, especially if your bike has a proprietary shaped seat post, if you're on a bit of a budget, or if you want just a temporary comfort solution. For example, if you have a race bike and you want to use it on a very long event and you just want it to be a little bit more comfortable. Thanks to viewer Putty Izzy for the recommendation on this product. I reached out to AirSeat and they sent this out for sample and testing. So let's dive in and see how it performs, and if you should put this on your shopping list. The AirSeat comes in 2 different specs with 4 different weight limits. There's the AirSeat 35, which is 350 grams and $49, and the AirSeat 25, which is 250 grams and $99. Each of those models comes with 4 weight limits depending on your weight and the riding position. Here I've opted for the AirSeat 25 to save as much weight as possible, and I've got the 130 kilogram spring size because of my high weight, and also I think it would benefit my riding conditions best if it were at least a little bit firm. We can see here that the weight is pretty spot on to what was expected, and also take a closer look at the design with the double front spring as well as the rear spring with a damper. Measuring around a little bit, the air spring will add about 3 centimeters of height, so you just need to drop your seat post by 3 centimeters. At the back, there's 8 millimeters of travel before hitting the rubber bumper, and a total of about 15 millimeters of travel in all. This is what it looks like mounted to an aluminum seat post. You can see there's a little movement to move fore and aft. Overall, it was really quick to install, no problems. With the saddle mounted, again, very easy installation. This is just a standard saddle, although it is required to use a saddle with metal rails. This is my phone mount on the back of the saddle for accelerometer testing. I've followed the same protocol I've used before and found some pretty interesting results. For this, I did 4 runs each for a rigid alloy seat post, carbon seat post, the air seat on top of both of those seat posts, as well as retesting the Redshift ShockStop Pro. And the results show that the air seat is quite competitive. It does a great job, especially on smooth roads and slightly worn roads, where on the carbon seat post it is the top performer. That shows that it's rather softly sprung. However, there is some pretty interesting findings on the hard hits. Basically, the air seat bottoms out when hitting larger bumps, and even though it still strongly outperforms a rigid seat post, there is that limitation that has been measured. Overall, it's highly competitive with the much more expensive ShockStop Pro, and when mounted to a carbon seat post, it actually weighs about the same. Objective testing only tells part of the story though, so let's take the air seat out on the road and see how it does subjectively. Okay, out here today testing the air seat, riding my favorite saddle that uses round rails, the Selle Italia SLR Boost. Some of my initial impressions from regular riding on the road is, first, the initial setup of the saddle is really important. The saddle needs to really be centered here on these assembly bolts. Otherwise, if it's moved too far backwards, only the back spring will activate and the nose will tilt up into the air. If the saddle is moved too far forward, only the front spring will activate and then the nose will tilt down. So that really needs to be centered correctly. And with this particular saddle, the nose tilting down is not an issue. It's the other way around, in fact. So here there's barely any space to reach an Allen key to tighten the bolts, and so I've moved the saddle as far forward as possible. It's just enough space so that it's centered, and so there's no problems with tilting down or up. Once the saddle's set up well, the air seat performs as expected. It matches the performance of the controlled test pretty well, where it does a great job when roads are smooth or slightly worn, all the way up to chip seal, but it does reach its limitations when hitting speed bumps or running off curbs. In some ways, it sometimes feels like it slightly outperforms the controlled tests, and I think it's partly due to the design here, where there's a lot of flexibility for movement at the front. So even though the seat is really locked in with these 2 bushings in the back, when there's a lot of movement, the seat is actually able to move physically forward, not just up and down. That extra little bit of freedom feels like it makes the air seat outperform what the test suggests just by a little bit. I thought it would feel sloppy that it has that flexibility, but it turns out to just be pretty comfortable. One potential area for concern is how wide the base of the air seat chassis is compared to the top of the saddle itself. So it's about 3 centimeters below the rails of the saddle, but it's still exactly as wide. In practice, this could mean that your leg inside of your thigh could rub on the chassis of the air seat. This did happen to me when I was wearing shoes that didn't have my normal spacers in them because I have a small leg length imbalance. So my shorter leg was, every pedal stroke was rubbing the inside of the chassis. That might not be a problem for everyone though, especially if your fit is nice and sorted. I'm doing a bit of a climb right now, testing out the air seat. It's a good time to check and see how it bobs. And there is a little tiny bit of bob. It's softer sprung than, say, the Redshift Shockstop Pro. So it's a little bit more noticeable in its bob, but overall it's really not that bad. As long as pedaling is a little bit smooth, if it gets erratic, the bob becomes more noticeable, but if I wasn't looking for it, I wouldn't notice it. But let's finish this climb. All right, I'm out here on a pretty blustery day today, testing the air seat. And the terrain here is this really rough, coarse chip seal. You can see my hand for comparison. And this is the kind of terrain that the air seat does really, really well at. Because the seat is completely decoupled from the seat post, there is a sense of isolation from the road buzz. And I think this is probably the type of terrain that the air seat does the best at. The air seat changing the saddle's orientation during riding can be felt just by moving around. If your position typically moves a lot from forward to back, that may be problematic. I noticed it when I tried to make it happen, but in regular use, it's much less of an issue. However, I did find when using the aero bars, I typically move forward a little bit, which causes the saddle to point down. On some saddles, this is actually quite a problem, but on others, it's what I would prefer anyway. So it really depends on your riding position if that change is going to be a positive or a negative thing, but it's going to tend to be more negative than positive for most people. One concern that I had with the air seat, just when looking at it online and when I first got it, was whether the saddle would list from left to right. And I was worried about that because of how disconnected the saddle is from the seat post itself. But what I found is that's not actually a noticeable issue at all. I've not noticed it in the slightest. And I think that's because this rear shock connection is rather stable. That prevents the saddle from tilting from side to side like this, even though on the front, the connection is much less sturdy. The back makes up for it and keeps it stable. Okay, after testing in various configurations and finishing up here with my ISM seat, I think I've reached a conclusion about the performance and qualities of the air seat. Overall, its main goal is to insulate from vibration. And because it's decoupling the seat from the seat post, it does this really, really well. That does come with some limitations though. There's a low amount of total travel, so hard hits and speed bumps are a limitation of the air seat. Some people will find that the tilting of the saddle forward and back, depending on where your weight is a deal breaker. And setup is key for that, making sure that the saddle is centered so that your weight, wherever you're sitting on the saddle, is also centered between these two shocks. In conclusion, what are the use cases for the air seat? And I think first, just as a budget piece, it's a very low cost entry into having some minimalist suspension system. So if you're curious about the idea of minimalist suspensions, this would be a top product to try because it's very high quality, The weight that's added to the bike is pretty manageable, a lot less than some other options at this price point, and the performance is just really good. If your bike has a proprietary seat post, you are more than likely able to use the air seat on that bike. And so whether it's an Aero seat post or whatever, you can add this to any bike, and it doesn't require the round 27.2 or 30.9 millimeter seat posts that some other products do. And lastly, I think a very interesting use case is for the rider who usually rides their race bike and enjoys a nice stiff bike most of the time, but wants to take that bike on a long course. If that's you, you can drop your seat post by 3 centimeters and add the air seat and put on your saddle, and all of a sudden your race bike becomes incredibly comfortable. This doesn't have to be a permanent solution, especially for the people who enjoy that road feel that I hear so many people caring about in the road bike space. So if that's you, you can, for a very low cost, add the air seat for very long rides or when it's going to be a little bit rough, and then go back to your very lightweight, race-oriented bike when you're done. And so I think for a lot of people, they would benefit from having an air seat available to them, if not on their bike all the time. As for me, I think this was sent out as a tester. There are some language barriers there, but I'm going to talk with the people at AirSeat and see if I can just buy this, because I want to have this around moving forward. I think it's an excellent product, and I have a few good ideas for bike builds that could use this as their form of minimalist suspension. But with that, I hope you found this informative, and I'll see you all in the next video. Ride safe.